Welcome, everyone. Welcome. While we're waiting for everybody to join, I am going to be using the platform Pear Deck to help with some interaction options for us. So as you are joining into the breakout room, if you are here for how to talk to young people about sexually explicit media and porn, you're in the right place. And if you could head over to Pear Deck, there's a couple of options for you. I just dropped in the chat the direct link to Pear Deck, so you can just click that directly from the Zoom chat. It'll open up a separate secondary browser on your screen. You can also join using a secondary device like a smartphone or a tablet by going to joinpd.com and then entering that code on the screen, KGX BVS. A couple of options. Welcome, everyone. So for those of us who are just joining, I am inviting everybody to join Pear Deck. This is going to be one of the ways that we're going to be doing interaction during this workshop. And so there's a couple ways to join. You can either click the direct link that's in the chat box and that'll open up a separate browser on your computer, or you can take a secondary device like your smartphone or a tablet. You can go to joinpd.com and then enter the code that you see on the screen or in the chat, KGXBVS. Welcome. So about half of folks who are in this meeting have joined Pear Deck. Excellent. I encourage folks, if they are interested in participating during this breakout session, to go to Pear Deck and join. It's going to be one of the main ways that we're communicating with one another. You can click the direct link that's in the chat, or on a secondary device, you can go to joinpd.com and enter the game code on the screen or in the chat, KGX BVS. I'm going to go ahead and start class. I'll drop that link into the chat box a couple more times at the start as folks are making their way in. Oh, looks like there's a lot more folks who are about to join. Excellent. Welcome. If you're just joining, you are in the breakout room for how to talk to young people about porn and sexually explicit media. I'm going to be using Pear Deck to help with some of the interaction options for us. So if you are interested in doing some interactive components today, head over to Pear Deck. I'll drop in the chat a direct link that'll open up a secondary browser. Or you could open up on a secondary device like a smartphone or a tablet by going to joinpd.com. and then entering the code KGX BVS. Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a second. Interesting. Some of us are saying that there's no audio. If there's no audio, I would check your audio settings. Maybe Sarah can support with folks in the chat who are unable to hear with checking their audio settings. I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody who's entered just so that you know that your audio is turned off. Some of us are saying they can't get into the Pear Deck. That is interesting. I'll drop in the link again and see if that helps. If not, we can also use the chat. I'm going to go ahead and get started since I know that it's a couple minutes into this breakout and I want to get to the content of it. If you can't get into Pear Deck, that's absolutely okay. You can just drop in all of your information as we're going through this into the Zoom chat. So welcome, my name is Avery. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Youth Services Manager at Health Connected. We are a small nonprofit that provides comprehensive relationship and sexual health education across California. And our mission is to equip young people with the information, skills, and support to make thoughtful choices about their relationships and sexual health throughout their lives. With that, I do want to hear a little bit about who you are. So either in the Zoom chat or if you did have a chance to get to Pear Deck, click the right-hand corner on Pear Deck that says discussion and share your name, your pronouns, and your connection with youth. So we get a sense of who all is in our room together. Maybe we're an educator, a social worker, a counselor, CASA. I'll drop in the Pear Deck information in the chat one more time for us. Excellent. And so some people have already dropped in who we are in both the chat and on Pear Deck. Welcome, Bree. Welcome, Nancy. Welcome, Delia, Sandra, Alex, Amanda, Allison, Tamara, Zelly. And for those of us who are having difficulties with the audio, Sarah is going to be checking in the Zoom chat. So you can head over to the Zoom chat and check in with Sarah about that. I'm just muting folks as they enter, so that you know that your audio is turned off. Welcome. It's good to see all of you. Lots of different relationships with youth in this breakout. Excellent. Excellent. Thank you, Jamie. Jamie in the chat said there's an audio button on the bottom left of your screen that might be helpful. Perfect. Keep introducing yourself in the either Pear Deck or in the chat so that we can get to know each other. I'm going to start off with a couple agreements in this space. I know that talking about pornography can sometimes be challenging for adults and youth alike. And so if we notice that there's stuff going on in our body, I invite us to practice our self-care, to figure out what we need and what our boundaries are in this space. I have started off by turning your audio off, but at any time you are welcome to respond to our discussion questions verbally, or you can use either the chat or the Pear Deck option, totally up to you, but I want to create as much flexibility for our needs in this space. My first agreement for us is to stay curious. So we might have very strong values about pornography and explicit media coming into this workshop, and that's absolutely okay. We're going to practice how to have non-judgmental conversations, and part of that is staying open and staying curious. The next one is using inclusive language. So for this, I want us to make sure that we're using affirming language when we're talking in our chats about bodies, identities, experiences, and professions. We're not using words that tear somebody down or stigmatize somebody. And then the last one I already mentioned is practice self-care. Notice when our body is telling us that we may need to take a break, we want to practice some deep breathing, or we want to take a moment to go grab some water and then rejoin the group. By the end of the breakout, I have some pretty lofty goals. I would love for us to be able to describe tools for engaging youth in conversations. I would also love for us to be able to define pornography and to identify resources and explain media literacy. A couple of us are saying that they cannot see my screen. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and reshare, and hopefully that will help us out. Some of us may be able to see it or not. Let's see if that works for us. All right, so I have reshared my screen. Hopefully that helped with a couple of us who were not able to see it. I also invite us throughout this to reflect on our own values, biases, and perspectives in order for us to better understand how to engage youth in non-judgmental conversations about explicit media. So with that, let's start off with some self-reflection and values work. I have a statement on the screen, and it says, watching pornography is bad. Head over to the chat box, either on Zoom or on Pear Deck, and share with me agree or disagree. And it's okay if you don't see my screen. I am going to I'm going to verbally say all of the stuff that's on my screen. It is an additional helpful seeing if some folks can see it, and then I'll check in with Sarah and see if there's something that we can do for folks who can't see it. Excellent. Thank you, everybody, putting in their thoughts in the chat. I'm going to show my responses on the Pear Deck so that we can see.
Okay.
A couple of us are saying agree, and the majority of us, both on Pear Deck and in the chat, are saying disagree. Very interesting. And I love that a lot of us are already wanting to explain our rationale, our perspective. I'm going to go ahead and hide the responses on Pear Deck, and I'm going to ask us to do just that. So either on Pear Deck or in the chat box, start sharing some of your reasoning. Why might somebody agree or disagree? And I'll summarize as I see them coming up, and I'll show the responses from Pear Deck on the screen. And if folks do want to unmute themselves and share verbally, that's also okay too. So I invite you now, if you would like to unmute and share verbally, you may do so.
Hi, yeah, I put down undecided because I was thinking like it really depends on a number of factors. Like pornography in and of itself, depending on what type, isn't necessarily bad or good. I just think it depends on if you have a addictive personality, because unfortunately, or if you have the added understanding and the ability or opportunity to process this with a safe person, preferably an adult who's not going to try to harm you. So that's kind of how I looked at that, because there's so much information out there. In fact, it's become so popular that it's become an area of research from what I understand, but it just depends, because most of us who grew up in like a conservative environment might say no, and then those who are a little bit more progressive might say it's fine, but it just depends on if there's a balance. That's kind of why I couldn't say yes or no. So
thank you so much for sharing that nuanced perspective. Anybody else want to unmute and share their perspective? It's okay if not. There are lots of responses that are coming in, and I'll start to summarize some of the ones that I see. A lot of people are saying it depends on factors, including the ethical nature of the porn. So whether or not actors were able to give consent. I'm also seeing it depends on the people who are watching it and how they're engaging with pornography, talking about different values that people might have that may influence their expectations about pornography and whether or not it's good or bad, the maturity of the person. Oh, pornography may have false expectations. And so there might be different reasons why people watch pornography, but we want to consider those false expectations. Thank you so much. Porn is produced. Oh, does somebody want to share?
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry, I have a little kitten in my background, so she's very loud. I don't know.
Oh, I love it.
Out of her. Okay. But I think, this is Stephanie from DC. I think it begs the comparison to guns and people, and we've all heard that guns in and of themselves are not dangerous, but the people behind them. And I think we could make that same argument for pornography, how we consume it, how it's made, for what point it's made. Like obviously snuff porn, we're getting, that's different than, so I think somebody said a lot of porn is vanilla. I do agree with that, and actually kind of boring. But I just, I think if we can separate, the art or the, the issue or of porn, the way that sometimes we're able to look at guns, it's what we do with the vehicle that makes it good or bad, not the vehicle, not the item in and of itself.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Stephanie. Were there other folks who wanted to share verbally? That's okay if not. I just noticed a couple people unmuted. I do want to highlight what Emma said in the chat. Watching porn is a great way to explore sexuality and kinks. It's also a great way to explore pleasure and desire. And so there's lots of different reasons why everybody who's watching pornography is watching pornography. And I love all of the nuance that you came up with in your responses to this. I really invite us to continue self-reflection about our own values when it comes to explicit media and pornography, because the youth that we're going to be having conversations with may have very different values regarding pornography. And that's absolutely okay. It's okay to have different values and still have non-judgmental conversations. So what I want to talk about right now is this askable attitude. How do we show up for the young people in our lives and be this askable person? This might be review for a lot of us, since we are in a lot of social work and care positions. I recommend to be curious and open when talking about pornography. So just like you're coming to this presentation being curious and open, we want to make sure we're letting youth lead, and we're here to listen and learn from youth. And instead of coming top down with our values and our opinions, first set the stage to hear what they're interested in, what their values are, and what they're curious to learn more about. It's also really important to be non-judgmental, not just in our words, but also in our body and our facial features. So if we are having this conversation and we notice that it's really hard for us to have non-judgmental body language or facial expressions, that's a cue to us that maybe we want to take a pause and say, thank you so much for bringing this conversation up. I'm noticing that this is a little uncomfortable for me, so I want to reflect on that. In the meantime, maybe look at these resources and we can start a conversation later. It's okay to take a pause on this conversation for you as well. And then be reassuring and calm. It can be really challenging for youth to have this conversation with us, and we want to make sure we're not shutting them down. And then be trustworthy. This is really challenging. Building trust is a process that takes a lot of time. So to be an askable person, maybe we want to start building trust in smaller ways, showing up and following through with things that we promised we were going to do. And that can lead us to be looked at as an askable person. And the last one is be accurate and honest. We might know a lot of stuff, we might know very little, and that's okay. Be accurate about facts instead of leading with your own values or perspectives. That allows the young person to take in all of the information and then decide for themselves what their perspective is. And then be honest about what you don't know. It's okay to not know stuff. If a young person asks you a question and you're like, I have no idea, we could look it up together. Or here are some resources, I'm going to do some learning, and then we can have this conversation at a later date. We also want to make sure we're providing multiple perspectives. Like you saw in the chat, there were so many different ways everybody in this breakout thought about that question. And so we want to make sure that we're giving lots of different perspectives so that the young person can take all of that into consideration when they're thinking about it critically for themselves. And then we also want to make sure we're providing resources. So that could be resources for us to continue our learning, and then youth-facing resources for them to continue their learning on their own. Not everybody is going to be comfortable having this conversation, and that's okay. You can be honest about that. I really appreciate you coming to me and asking me these questions, but I'm a little uncomfortable. Here are some resources that I think are going to be really helpful for you to do some additional learning and to get some of those questions answered. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what can make it challenging to discuss pornography with young people? I see some people have already put some thoughts that they have in the chat, and I'd love to hear from you. So either on Pear Deck or in the chat, go ahead and answer this question. And I love what people are putting in the chat. I think about safety, not my personal values. Are my kids safe, sexually safe, emotionally safe, mentally safe? And that means their relationship with us. I love that perspective as an askable person. Yes, and feel free to unmute and share if you would rather.
I'm actually glad that we're doing this, because this is, even though I don't carry cases anymore, I do assist my colleagues in DC to have conversations around independence and transitional transitions from where they are currently to adulthood. And this is one of the most awkward conversations. So half the time I'm always like, I leave it as, if we even get to that point, like, you know, what does caring for yourself look like? Do you have trusted adults you can have a conversation with around difficult topics like sex? And I just kind of generalize it because I'm not the person that is like assigned to them. But even for myself, it's like, it's really difficult because there is a little bit of an embarrassment and vulnerability and shame component. I was thinking even for a lot of us who are adults, it's difficult. So I can't imagine. And half the time, the youth are like, oh my God, why do I have to be here? It's another meeting. And so it's just, I might be lucky if I can get them to even do one, along with the worker, to do 1 or 2 topics. And this is definitely not the first of their picks. So yeah. So I'm glad to get some ideas on how to ask those questions appropriately and with cultural humility. So thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think a lot of people can relate to that. Stephanie, did you want to add?
Yeah, actually, that's my colleague too here in DC. So I'm really, I always love what Ms. Hong adds to the conversations. But this is reminding me of a case that I have right now where I feel like the previous social worker didn't know how to engage in the topic of sexual health, and a youth ended up pregnant and then terminating the pregnancy, and is having, for this particular youth, that is resonating as a traumatic experience. So I feel like, when you were talking about if we're not comfortable ourselves, one of our jobs, one of our basic skills as clinicians should be to get them to somebody else who can do it if we can't.
Absolutely.
So the first question I had was, why didn't we have a sexual wellness, checkup? If you can't, obviously I'm not a medical provider, but if you can't have, even that basic conversation, then you immediately want to take your youth to somebody who can have that more basic and then more detailed conversation and be a part of that process. And then, and learning from our colleagues in other fields. So, sitting in on maybe a sexual wellness exam if the youth permits it, and then you are hearing how an RN or a doctor is discussing those conversations. There's just a lot of ways that we can grow, I think, through, field interactions and peer-to-peer supervision. So I don't have a lot of difficulty talking about sex as a queer person. But some of my teammates don't really know how to discuss it. So then it's like being there for your teammates. Like we can't do this alone. And I think for those of us that carry cases, to remember that we have teams behind us and people around us that can help us build this competency to keep our youth safe and informed.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Stephanie. And I think a lot of the stuff that got brought up in the Pear Deck responses and in the chat are spot on. There's so many things that people are thinking about when having this conversation. And I'm not going to cover all of them. You came up with so many more, but these are some basic ones that come up a lot. That we have different values. Maybe we're worried that the conversations we're having with young people are in conflict with their other family or friendship values. And so it's okay, again, to have different values. And that's why I think it's really important to let youth lead, to be curious and open, and to curate the conversation about what they are interested in and providing facts first. That can be really helpful if we're worried about liability on our end, is to not give our own opinions or values, but instead let it be youth-led so that they can do the critical thinking and the work to figure out what their values are. And then a lot of us set our own hangups. It could be triggering for us. That's absolutely true. And I love what you both said, that if that is the case, if we're noticing this stuff coming up for us, then it's best to connect the youth with resources and other trusted adults who may be able and more comfortable having those conversations. It's normal for us to have feelings about pornography. And so that's why self-reflection is incredibly important when doing this work. Also, I saw a lot of people talking about how young people might be really hesitant to talk to us about this. And so start building trust in other low stakes ways. Start having these conversations in different areas. I saw a bunch of people saying, how much time does it take? Well, this is not just a one-time conversation like all sexual health conversations. It should be happening at scaffolded different ages. And so there are different topics that we can be talking about from younger ages. And I will provide some resources and some guides depending on the developmental age of the young person that you're talking to. And you can talk even in elementary school about things like consent and boundaries and healthy relationships that can really help build the framework for having conversations about explicit media. And the last one is lack of knowledge. Some of us do not know a lot of information, and that's totally okay. I want to provide some resources for us today. So I've included a handout with this. There are 3 different pages. 2 of them you can see on my screen. So one is conversation starters for trusted adults. So if you know that you're in a position where you want to start having conversations, I've included some topics for values, ethics, and intimacy in relationships to help bridge that gap, start that conversation. I've also included a ton of different resources for lots of different aspects of talking about porn. So if you want more detailed nitty-gritty advice and talking tips for talking to young people about pornography, I've included a ton of articles and videos and resources in this top one. This next one are educational activities. So for those of us who are educators and in the classroom, this can be useful. I've also found it really helpful for folks who work one-on-one with youth to do some of these physical activities together, or even in group homes if you wanted to have a conversation all together. And then I've included lots of information on laws. A lot of people have questions about child pornography, sextortion, child or cyber exploitation, or also known as revenge porn. So I've included lots of different links for laws and some links for California legal support. So if you do have young people who want to be connected to legal support, there are 2 links here. And then the last one are guides. That's what I just mentioned. So those are guides scaffolded for age groups so that you can see what that developmental process would look like for these different conversations, as well as youth-facing resources. So if you want to give them some material while you're figuring out how to have these conversations, I love the 6-Minute Sex Ed podcast. They do have material on all different sex ed topics, including porn and sexting laws. And then I love Scarlet Teen. Again, this is a youth-friendly resource that there's so much information about queerness, about porn, about media literacy that young people can get exposed to. And then Teen Health Source is another one of my favorites. And then somebody asked, is there any way we can get these materials via email? If you want to just DM me one-on-one in the Zoom chat with your email, I can send this to you directly in your email. They should also be posted on the portal as well to download. All right, so with the last couple minutes I have, I want to introduce us to media literacy as a framework for having these critical thinking conversations. Before I dive in, I want to define porn for us. So there are lots of different definitions out there. When I'm talking to young people, this is the definition that I use. Sexually explicit material, usually videos and images, that show people in sexual situations with the intent to arouse. And so there's lots of different categories of porn out there. Some people already called out some of them in the chat box. When I'm talking about porn, I'm usually focusing on a specific category called mainstream pornography. That's the stuff that a lot of the young people in my life are exposed to because it's free and it's very easy to find. That's going to be your streaming websites like Google, like Pornhub, like Xtube. That would all be considered mainstream pornography. And there are some things that mainstream pornography have in common that other types of pornography like queer or feminist pornography don't necessarily have. Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing your emails in the chat. I see them. So media literacy as a framework allows us to think critically about the media we consume by asking questions about its design, production, and content. I'm just going to move past these really fast because I know that we're running out of time. I did a reflection with San Francisco State University young adults, and I asked them this question before seeing porn for the first time. I wish I had known. And I asked them this question to get a better understanding of what are some of the key messages that they wanted to make sure we talk to young people about. And a couple of them that stood out to me that I'm sure as you're reflecting on what you wish you had known are, I wish I had known it was acting and not a documentary. So if we're gonna give you some key messages about pornography, these are some main ones. Porn is produced. It's often edited. So even the still shots, the images that somebody might see, people are doing different angles. They're putting on different filters, doing different lighting to get the desired effect. For videos, they might take a pause on their shoots and then restructure it so that they get a better position, a better angle so that it looks a certain way. And so porn is edited in lots of different ways, and there's lots of different filmmaking techniques behind that. Porn is also a business. It is a profession for a lot of people. And so when you're thinking about porn, you probably want to follow the money. That's going to give us a lot of information about who the intended audience is that the producers have in mind. And that's going to structure a lot of the themes and the stereotypes that we see coming up in mainstream pornography. Also, actors perform pleasure. That's their job. They're actors. If the goal of pornography is to make the person watching it feel aroused, then if the actors are performing pleasure and we feel that on their end, they did their job. So there's no way of us really knowing in the moment as we're watching pornography if these actors are actually feeling pleasure or just performing it. And that's really important. If people are using porn as de facto sex ed, to understand that not everything they see on screen is going to feel the way we think it feels based on how the actors are performing. It's all about communication with our partners, checking in to make sure things are feeling good, switching things up if they're not feeling good, and having those conversations about boundaries. And the last one with porn is produced is that it's about what bodies are doing rather than about the intimacy and connection with people. That's really at the end of the day what porn's about for mainstream pornography. It's about what bodies are capable of doing and the actual behaviors rather than connection. Another big thing that came up in that focus group is that lots of different bodies can have sex, be attractive, and express sexuality differently. So when it comes to mainstream pornography and pornography in general, it reflects society and it amplifies societal ideas, values, and stereotypes. That means that mainstream pornography content may be titled, tagged, or cataloged based on harmful stereotypes, which amplifies them. Content can also objectify or fetishize certain identities. So objectifying means to focus on one part of that person, like a body part, a penis. It could also be fetishizing someone, which is boiling someone down to just one aspect of them and not granting them the full scope of humanity. And that can feel really degrading for somebody who's watching that, who shares that identity, whether that's their gender, their race, their sexual orientation, their body size. Content may also conflate violence and non-consent with pleasure, which can be pretty challenging if somebody's looking at pornography for information on how to have healthy and fulfilling relationships. Content can also reinforce and fetishize unrealistic body standards. These are actors. They're often hired because they have certain traits that the porn industry finds desirable. It doesn't necessarily represent the huge scope of human diversity. I do want to highlight, though, that porn is not a monolith. I've been talking about mainstream pornography. There are lots of different types of porn out there. And people do find pornography that affirms who they are, affirms their identities and desires, teaches them more about how they want to be intimate with another person. And so I want to highlight the different perspectives that people have with pornography. It really comes down to fetishization versus giving somebody humanity and letting them have the full scope of who they are as a human and not boiling them down to just one aspect of their identity. The last one I want to highlight before we move to question and answer is that I might get dependent on watching images instead of using my imagination. I find it helpful to talk with young people about porn's effect on the developing brain. It can help things click into place and make a little bit more sense for them. Our brain is fueled by dopamine. Dopamine's released when we experience pleasure, and it can make us feel good. But the brain doesn't respond as strongly to the first time as it does to every other secondary stimulus. So for example, we eat our favorite food. The first bite is amazing. Our brain releases a surge of dopamine. The 7th or 8th bite of that food, it still tastes good, but it doesn't feel as good as it did the first bite that we had. And that's because our brain isn't releasing the same amount of dopamine. And the same can be true of pornography. Somebody might notice the first time they watch a video, it feels really fun and really good. The second or third time, they don't get that same experience. So they may feel compelled to seek out more novel pornography or more extreme pornography that doesn't actually align with their values or their desires. And if they're noticing this compulsion, it can be really helpful to have some self-reflection and see if it's affecting other parts of their life. Is it affecting how they're able to get up and go to work, how they're able to go to school, their relationships that they have with other people? And if it is affecting them, maybe reaching out to a professional to get support, because we can absolutely change our patterns. We just may need some support in doing so. And to wrap up my key messages for young people, watching pornography is essentially another sexual behavior, even if it's not shared with another person. And like any other sexual behavior, it's important for us to be informed and intentional in order to make the decisions that are best for us. And some of the youth in our life may not have models of healthy relationships so that they can look at pornography and compare that to what they want in their healthy relationships. So I like to remind youth that relationships should be consensual, respectful, positive, and mutual. So with that, I do want to let you know that all the information I covered on media literacy is also in that handout that I will email to the folks that I see the emails in the chat. Thank you so much for putting those in there. As a final reflection before Q&A, I would love to hear something that you learned about yourself during this workshop. So either head over to Pear Deck and drop that in, or just drop it into the chat box for us. You can also unmute and share if you prefer.
Oh, perfect. I was just thinking, because I'm Korean American, but I was thinking with everything that's been said, especially you hit the key word on the head, fetishization, and that's interesting because I think a lot of us as clinicians, and even taking that out for a second, but as adults who went through the awkwardness of puberty, we can probably relate a lot more than we'd like to admit to a lot of our young adults, but we've had the maybe advantage and sometimes disadvantage of having more experience. But I am definitely inspired to try a little bit more to get out of my comfort zone. But I also notice even with fetishization, I feel like there's that correlation between violence, and even among our young people, they don't have that opportunity because a lot of times they only are going based on what's modeled before them. And if they don't have the
Absolutely.
opportunity to share, it's hard because also there's a lot of implicit bias. And so if we're not having those conversations, they only have what they see off of social media. And so I think it's the drawback for things like pornography when it's not done correctly, is it can desensitize a person's ability to make a connection that's genuine with other people, and even understand the difference between reality and fantasy, which then leads to unhealthy or maladaptive behaviors. And so, and which you see a lot of times in when you're going through that phase of development of developing your first relationships, which is why it's so difficult sometimes, because there's this sense of shame and lack or desire not to want to be vulnerable because that's what they're taught, which is that's weakness. When in actuality, to me, it takes a lot of courage to really unpack these things and be vulnerable and open enough to say, I need help, so that's what I was just thinking. And it would be cool to kind of have that conversation mutually with the not just other clinicians, but other adults who are involved.
Yeah, totally.
But it's a work in progress. So that's what I was just thinking. So thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think that that's so true. I just did a very cursory overview of different strategies and some key messages, but there's lots more additional learning if you would like in that resource list that I'll share back out. And so if you want to do more very in-depth conversations, there are lots of great conversation starters there. Well, thank you for everybody who shared in the chat and on Pear Deck your reflection for today. You've got this. Reach out to me if you have questions. My email is my first name, Avery@healthconnected.org. I'll put that in the chat for us as well in case you want to have a one-on-one conversation with me, or you wanted to have a more in-depth conversation about porn. I do a lot of porn workshops for young people and for adults. So I'm going to transition into question and answer. Sarah, were there any questions that came into the chat box that I may have missed? Nope, they're not. So I just open floor. Feel free to unmute yourself, ask a question, or drop the question in the chat box. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you all have. All right, it doesn't seem like there's a ton of questions right now. That's okay, maybe they'll come. Oh, what are the most common difficult questions about porn from youth? Excellent question. So it sort of depends on how on the nose about porn you consider some of the questions. I get questions that are about acts that people see in pornography. So what is the common number of people in a threesome? Does it count as rape if she moans? A lot of things or themes that come up in pornography about penis size, about pleasure in penis size. And how do you answer them? I love that. So actually, I kind of want to throw this back on us and see if we want to practice answering some questions. I put some in here. And so if you would like to, you can either answer in the chat box or you can practice unmuting. I think it's really helpful to actually have some language when answering questions. So I'm going to start off with this one and then we'll do a more challenging one. What's the point of porn? Anybody want to try to answer this one? Thank you, Emma, in the chat box, starting us off, entertainment. To spice things up, thank you, Carla. I love it, providing different perspectives, to arouse, sexual gratification, and you can include all these in your answers. If a young person came to me and asked, what's the point of porn? I'd probably turn it back and I'd ask, what do you think? Why do you think people watch porn? And then go from there. And so you're coming up with lots of different reasons why people would watch pornography. Excellent job. I got another question in the chat. Do you find that male or female identifying youth have different questions about porn? Yes and no. I find that depending on how I'm talking to young people, I might have different experiences. If I'm in a big group of young people, I find that male identifying youth often have more focal questions about pornography, but then when I'm one-on-one or I'm going around the room and checking in with folks, female identified youth have lots of questions that they just don't want to ask out loud. But the content of the questions I find is very similar. A lot of it is about how realistic is pornography? And then is pornography healthy or harmful are some of the two most common ones. And then the legality of porn. Is it okay to watch porn under 18? Am I going to get in legal trouble if I watch porn? Those are some of the different questions I get. Oh, thank you, Milan. I get a lot more questions from youth when there's an anonymous box. Yes, I find that too. That's usually why I like to set up something like a Pear Deck so that there's an anonymous way for young people to connect with me and ask questions so that they don't have to have their name attached to it. Thank you, Crystal. How do you help someone with addiction to porn? So there's lots of different thoughts about porn addiction and whether or not that is a thing. There's research that points to it being closer to an addiction or closer to a compulsion. For me as an educator, I want to steer away from using the word addiction because I think it's really stigmatizing and it can shut young people down by using that word. So I like to talk about patterns and whether or not patterns are serving us and give them some concrete examples about how porn use may be interfering with their relationships, with their experience of pleasure, and then with their daily life, like being able to go to school or go to work. And then how do you help somebody with addiction to porn? It depends on which professional you can hook them up with. A lot of people would hook them up with a counselor or a psychologist who has a lot of work in pornography and compulsory behavior, and then they can help them work through it. Some people just detox completely from pornography. They stop watching it, and then they can slowly reintroduce it in a more healthy way for them. So there's different strategies. I'm not a professional for this. I'm mostly an educator for young people. So I don't have as much information about the actual how-to of helping folks. Great questions. Trying to see if I missed any questions in the box. Okay, so let's do another question since we have a couple more minutes. Is porn real sex? How would you answer this one? You can either unmute or putting it in the chat box. Is porn real sex? Thanks, Eden. Depends on the type of porn. Yeah, what do you define as real sex? I love that. I love that. I love that you're going to put it back on the youth and ask them, well, what do you think real sex is? Sometimes the youth I talk to get really confused about whether or not porn actors are actually having sex or engaging in sexual behaviors. So that could be something to clear up. Yes, they are actually engaging in sexual behaviors, but what do you count as real sex? What does real sex mean to you? And maybe they'll talk about intimacy and connection, and you can then have conversations about how porn may not show a lot of those different steps. They don't necessarily show the warm up or the giggles or the laughter or the sweetness that can be involved in sex. Oh, very interesting, Caitlin. Thank you for sharing that. There are some porn actors on TikTok that post an accurate day on a porn set type videos. It's very informative, really shows how carefully constructed it is. That's really cool. Yeah, thank you, Stephanie, in the chat. True, depends on the type of porn. Lots of actors make distinctions between their work and their sex lives. Okay, what about this one? I get this one all the time. Am I gay when I watch gay porn? Thank you, Stephanie. Just no. Thank you, Emma. Watching gay porn does not make you gay. Yeah, sometimes the things that we find interesting and arousing while we're watching pornography may not actually align with our own desires or what we want to do with another intimate partner. Sexual activity, sex, and sexual orientation are not the same. Identity is always yours to decide. Your actions or even your sexual behaviors don't define your sexuality. Beautiful. I love this. Okay, this one's a little bit more intense. Do all girls like being choked? So this comes from stereotypes around pornography where there's violent imagery that they're seeing. Thank you, Michelle. No.
I was gonna say, if I may,
Yes.
I would probably answer to that. It really depends on the person, like anything else. They have preferences, but just keep in mind, it's important to have conversations beforehand, like before clothes come off, because for someone who's been through some type of trauma, that can re-trigger that experience. So, you know, just to be mindful of that. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I see some of us have to go. Yes, we're 1 minute out. Stephanie, did you want to add real quick?
Yeah, I just wanted to and put this out there to the group. Like for me personally, depending on who my partner is, even my sexuality, my sexual activity changes. So it's, you know, our kids can understand that, you know, who they are in a sexual interaction can vary from person to person of who their partner or partners are. And bring out different parts of your personality. So it's not like you have to like one thing and you like that one thing with every person you're with forever, you know?
Absolutely. I really love that. And I'm going to let Stephanie's word be the last. Thank you so much for coming today. My email's on here if you want to reach out, avery@healthconnected.org. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. I'll send out that porn handout in a little bit. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Glad to hear it. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.